Welcome to the lecture on change management. In order to drive home the importance of a well-managed change management process, it is imperative to showcase what can go wrong when the change lifecycle is not properly followed or implemented. Let's look at Equifax data breach which happened in 2017. So, Equifax is one of the three largest consumer credit scoring agencies in the US. The basic idea of these agencies is that they create credit reports for people and give an overall idea of a person's credit history, including things like if they have paid off loans, credit cards, and so on. In simple words, they generate a person's credit score, and then banks, lenders, and sometimes even employers rely on this score to decide whether to approve a loan, mortgage, or job application. So, as you can well imagine, it's a very important agency. In 2017, Equifax announced that their systems had been breached, and that included a breach of personal sensitive data of around 147 million Americans. The data included names, home addresses, phone numbers, date of births, and even social security numbers and driver licenses. In addition to that, credit card numbers of more than 200,000 customers were also compromised. So you can well imagine the scale of this breach. Now, here's the thing, this breach, which is probably one of the biggest in the history, resulted from not following a proper change management process. So, what happened was that Apache Struts, a web application framework which was used by Equifax, had a critical vulnerability. The Equifax security team did find out about that and they had investigated it and they had sent out an internal advisory to apply the patch. However, the change management process was not properly followed and the patch never got applied to a key public facing system. As a consequence, attackers exploited the unpatched system for upward of 70 days. They were able to gain access to all of that sensitive information of 147 million Americans. Now, the thing that you need to keep in mind, number one, the vulnerability was known. So the Equifax security team did know about the vulnerability. Secondly, the patch was available. In certain instances, for example, if it's a 0-day vulnerability and it's very new, sometimes patches may not be available if it's a very recent vulnerability, okay, like 0-day. But in this case, the vulnerability was known, the patch was available. But it was a failure to follow through and authorize change as part of the change management process. Therefore, while change management is not directly a core part of cybersecurity controls, but it has tremendous implications on the security posture of an organization. So let's formally define the change management policy. So the change management policy basically oversees the change management process. And what is it? It's a formal document that defines how changes to IT systems must be proposed, approved, implemented, and reviewed. So the change management policy defines the end-to-end life cycle of change management. And understanding this end-to-end life cycle is very important. And remember, the key motivation to having a well-defined change management policy is to avoid business disruptions, prevent unauthorized changes, and ensure that accountability is built in the process itself. Now, let's look at the end-to-end change management process. And I'm also going to walk you through a real-world example so that you can place each of these phases correctly in a real-world situation. So the first step is raising a request. So someone needs to propose a change formally. And by formally, we means he needs to actually apply it maybe online or through a written document. It needs to be a formal request. Now, the use case that I'm going to discuss through this lecture is that of enabling multi-factor authentication across all user accounts. So in terms of request, imagine a security architect has raised a formal request, a formal change request to implement multi-factor authentication across all user accounts. So he needs to provide details. For example, in that request, he needs to specify the purpose. The purpose would be to improve login security. What's the scope of the change? All of the staff across all departments. What's the timeline? Maybe roll out over 4 weeks. And also identify the risks. So the risks could be, for example, some of the non-technical staff who are not very familiar or well-versed with MFA, they may have potential login issues. After a request has been submitted, the organization needs to review the change, analyze the risk, impact, and business needs. So for example, in the case of multi-factor authentication example that we were discussing, there could be a change advisory board or a change reviewer who evaluates the proposal. And what are they going to evaluate? What systems will be impacted? Is user training or documentation needed? And can this affect critical workflows or important clients? Once the review is complete, a change advisory board or manager signs off, and this is called as approval. And the change advisory board approves the change based on whether a risk analysis has been completed, is there a rollback plan, and are there clear user communication plans? Because all of the users that could be potentially impacted, this needs to be communicated to them well in advance and in very clear terms so that they know exactly what's going to happen and what are the steps they need to take maybe proactively. The next is testing. So testing is done in a staging environment. So they may pick up a pilot environment. For example, they may just discuss it with the IT department and test the changes with them. And the things that they're going to test are, for example, login flows on different types of devices, laptops, desktops, mobile phones, backup codes, account recovery, is it working properly? Now, implementation is where things or the changes are actually rolled out to production. So usually this is done in phases. It's phased out. So normally it's not recommended to do an organization-wide change, except in certain situations, of course. So usually they phase it out, they roll it out. And for example, they may start with IT department, then HR and finance, then operations, and then engineering over a span of 4 weeks. And during this time, the security team is going to monitor for issues. The next phase is documentation. So all of the actions need to be logged in the ticketing system. So for example, who approved the change, when was it applied, who was affected, and were there any incidents? And if there were, they also need to be documented. And finally, there is the post-change review, which basically refers to lessons learned or if the rollback plan was tested. So at a high level, did the change meet its objectives? Were there any issues or outages? Should the process be improved for any future changes? So you see, it's a very carefully laid out step-by-step plan, which ensures that at the end of the day, a change is not going to disrupt business, create new vulnerabilities in the cybersecurity posture. Let's have a look at the different types of changes. So first of all, you could have standard changes. So standard changes are routine changes and they typically have low risk. But please keep in mind, some of the standard changes, they do not require the full change management process every time. For example, resetting password. Okay, that is a change, but it doesn't require a full end-to-end life cycle. Even for those changes, they still need to be documented and they should follow a predefined, automated or approved process. The next type of change are emergency changes. For example, a critical vulnerability has been discovered and there is a patch available and it needs to be applied immediately. We can't wait for the complete change management lifecycle, like for example, raise a request, wait for approval and risk analysis, those kind of things. So sometimes it's very urgent. So in this case, we may bypass certain steps. For example, instead of a full risk assessment, it could be a quick one. However, even emergency changes still need to be logged, to be justified, and they should include rollback plans in case something goes wrong. So we don't want to create a new problem while trying to solve the problem of a vulnerability. The third type of changes are major changes. For example, if you are migrating a database, replacing a firewall solution with another one, in this case, we do need to go through the full cycle, especially because when we are not hard pressed for time, so a proper risk analysis, for example, needs to be done, proper review processes, approvals, everything needs to be done. So as always, let's tie these concepts back to how they could be useful for you in your day-to-day job. So understanding the change management process may help you to maybe help approve or reject change requests based on risk, ensure security testing is done before rollout, log and track changes in a ticketing system, or flag unauthorized changes during audits.